Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm doing a series of recordings to kind of highlight different aspects of government policy in terms of as we go forward with the election. One of the things I'd like to highlight is there's a feeling I get when I watch different videos and different links of people is there's a lot of pandering for votes, and that's typically what happens when you get election. There's a lot of stuff that floats around to kind of get people to vote for a particular party without really dealing with the details. The goal of my various presentations and videos is to kind of give you some little bit factual questions to ask or even do a bit more digging. This particular presentation I'm actually targeting Ralph Goodale, and there's a reason why I'm targeting Ralph Goodale. Is he's a former Minister of Finance for Canada. He's served basically for 30 plus years in cabinet for the Liberal Party of Canada, and basically under John Chrétien as well as Paul Martin. And he's a typical person that is trying to go between Justin Trudeau's youth movement to the Liberal Party and connect the dots to the senior veterans like the Scott Brysons, the Julie Scrolls of the world, to kind of merge the old and the new parts of the party together. So Justin Trudeau likes to lean on Ralph Goodale because he likes to kind of push people to make sure that he connects a dot between the two groups of people. Let me tell you a little bit about Ralph Goodale, so those of you who don't know who he is. He's a long-serving MP. He's from Saskatchewan. He actually serves in the Regina riding. He's basically been a Liberal true and blue. He's worked a little bit in the private sector, but not a lot. He moved back to politics, and near the end of his term with the Liberal under Paul Martin's government, he was Minister of Finance. So that's kind of a brief gist of where Ralph Goodale came from. Now, let's talk about factors. If we're going to talk about things, we need to talk about things in perspective. And what I mean by that is you can't look at the end results and listen to statements from Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau will say to you, Liberals balance budgets, Conservatives don't. Well, there's truth to somewhat to that statement, but it's not completely valid. Because Stephen Harper, when he took office in 2006, his first annual report would have been 2007. So for 2006 to 2007, 2007 to 2008, Stephen Harper actually ran a balanced budget and ran a surplus. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. You can go out and look at the government financial statements by going to the federal government of Canada's website. So you don't have to take my words as valid. You can always go out and look at that, but the facts are there in terms of the financial statements, which Justin Trudeau never talks about. Second point is, yes, during the 90s, tough decisions were made. Okay, we were hitting a very high threshold in our debt to GDP ratios. So the government was forced into austerity measures. What they did as part of that austerity measure is they did a multitude of things. One, they rolled a strong U.S. economy that was driven by a strong U.S. consumer spending to a housing market and all that, which led to higher than normal growth in the 90s. The higher than normal growth in the 90s helped Canada export more because the U.S. is a bigger export market for us, and plus with the low dollar, it made our exports cheaper. Well, that's only a few factors in the 90s. Okay, Canada still had a pretty tough taxation structure. Our GST was 7%. Our corporate rates are pretty high relative to other countries in the OECD, as well as pretty close to the way the US was running. So taxation-wise, Paul Martin didn't reform things. He also didn't reform any really major trade deals, whether that was investment with China or India or Europe. He didn't do anything. He basically rolled NAFTA exports as part of his overall fiscal management cycle, and that allowed him to bring in surpluses. And surpluses, again, as I'll refer to you, that I've discussed in previous presentations with my debt and deficit presentation. Surplus means I'm collecting more revenue than I have to pay out. So how is a $14 billion surplus good? Well, in a particular case in the 90s, it paid down the debt, but it also starved the system. So that allowed the federal government ran expenses at bare minimum, and some places cut. They didn't put a lot of investment in healthcare. They cut it back by 2% of GDP. They didn't put a lot of money into infrastructure, cut it back or held it. So basically, if you starve a system for 10 years, what you're doing then is you're delaying the inevitable down the road. And the reason I say that is Justin Trudeau is pretty good at telling that Harper's scale back purchases to delay them to future periods. Well, he's not one that should be talking. The Liberals have a historical record of delaying stuff to future periods for other governments to fix. And recently in his interviews, he's basically saying he's going to run deficits up to 2019. But he doesn't have a clear plan on that. So in other words, he basically thinks that Keynesian economics works. And what Keynesian economics really is, in a nutshell, is government intervention into the economy to help it keep it going. The idea is the more money you put in the economy, the more the private sector will scoop up. But at some point, the private sector has to absorb that in the job creation, or you'll be stuck with structural deficits. And that's what you're seeing in the U.S. And the reason I bring that up, because it's perfect timing in terms of Trudeau supports Obama, which is Keynesian, and Obama's big into Keynesian economics. So let's talk about how it's like to deal with Ralph Goodale. Okay, Ralph Goodale is probably a very nice guy, I'm sure he is. However, if you disagree with Ralph Goodale, what I found out the hard way is he doesn't like facts. And this particular screen shows you when I responded to him with details on transfers, economic trends on the debt and deficit, he actually called me an operative, which I'm not. I'm a concerned citizen who wants to make sure the information gets out so people can make their own decision on who they want to elect. But that's not what Ralph Goodale says with this message. He's basically telling me that I don't listen to anybody else, that only 30% would probably share my belief. In the same token, he doesn't look at the polls because only 30% believe the Liberal Party. So 70% are against him. So you could see how he twists things around. I wanted to show you that because these are some of the things you deal with when you start making posts to politicians that don't really want to hear the truth. Now, let's talk about Paul Martin. Paul Martin was a wonderful person and should be given credit to bringing the debt to GDP down. That's fine, and he's applauded for that effort. Okay, but what he's not applauded for and what is not known is his methods. As I mentioned earlier, he starved the system by taking precious dollars out of healthcare that went to the provinces. Provinces then made cuts in their system, which then forced their way down to the municipalities, right? So honestly, when you starve a system, you're actually hurting it over the long haul, and decisions have to be made in terms of how the governments at the provincial and municipal level operate. That's not what's been told. And he didn't have to starve the system that bad. He could have did some other ways in terms of moving trade and exports. He could have looked at other ways on the income taxation structure, but he chose not to. He chose to basically ride the taxation, take money from EI, and that happens all the time. No government's immune from that. Basically, all they do is they basically rework the programs in a strong economy, see if way they cannot take some of that money back through assessing the liability accounts whether or not they're valid. However, Paul Martin ran on that, but that's never discussed as part of the budget cycle. So if Justin Trudeau gets elected, will he use the same methods, which is reevaluate the liability accounts, take money from them to make sure that he can use it other ways for his means? So he's using them as slush funds. This slide here, I just wanted to show you where we came from in GDP. We're a country of about 810 billion in GDP in 1995. We're now close to 2 trillion now. That's all I want to get out of that slide. This one just shows you the trend and ties to what I said, where you see the trough, that's where the cuts happen in terms of healthcare and social transfers. And then you see the gradual growth. So yes, Goodale will tell you that he actually put money back in the system, but that system was already starved. But he won't tell you that at that point. He'll just say that I'm bringing in with authority, but he won't tell you that basically prior to that they starved the system. This is just looking at to you to kind of highlight the point of perspective. And I mentioned this in previous presentations when you deal with healthcare, is that basically when Stephen Harper came in, he honored the agreement of the 6% to healthcare. He's actually changed it up as we get into later on in 2017 to it's tied to GDP. He wanted it to be sustainable. But you will not hear that. What you're going to hear is based on Justin Trudeau's platitudes that Harper's cutting funding. He's not. He's growing it each year at a slower pace. Let's talk about Mr. Goodale's report card. He highlighted 6 items here. 157 billion new debt, still in deficit, 2 recessions, record trade deficits, record household debt, 160,000 more jobless, and and worst job quality in 20 years. So he's given Stephen Harper a failing card. Let's talk about the 150 new debt. Okay, and I've talked about this in previous presentations, so I won't need to spend a lot of time here. The 150 new debt started with the stimulus, which was mandated or forced on to Stephen Harper by Stéphane Dion, Jack Layton, and the Bloc Québécois. They wanted money to bail out the auto industry, bail out the forestry, as well as stimulus and infrastructure funding. That's basically never discussed. What's discussed is the end result of the 150 million in new debt. Most of that debt is through a combination of the stimulus, reducing of taxes. Remember what I said to you in previous, tax cuts started under Martin, continued under Harper. It also brought in additional spending to make sure that we bumped up military, veterans affairs, social programs like OAS and all that were all bumped up to make sure that we recovered. So he never cut program spending. Yes, he might have tweaked it in a year or two here to scale it back a little bit to the cost of inflation, but if you look at the starting year Harper and over he is, you'll see growth that program spending has actually increased by 40% since Harper took office. He's honored the transfers. There's more money. There's almost 50% more money in healthcare than there was when Mr. Harper started. Those are the facts. Okay. He's also created dedicated funds for infrastructure, gas tax, as well as the Build Canada Fund, which is not discussed either. Okay. And now we can go in a lot more details around the issues with infrastructure, but I've covered that into another video. If you are interested, I covered it in a video where Kevin Page discussed with Don Martin of CTV, where I actually discussed the issues with municipalities, some of that being structural issues between downloaded cost from like OPP cost or compensations issue through arbitration processes or through basically overall pension reforms. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. This is just showing you that, as I said to you, this is based on the government's financial statements. So when Stephen Harper took office, there was a $13 billion surplus. Now if you look at the flow through, you're seeing that Stephen Harper gradually put money back into the system as well as reduced tax cuts. It gives you the different amounts. So that by the time we get into last annual report, because the new one's not done yet, you'll see that Stephen Harper at the height had a $55 billion deficit. Now, as I say to people, you cannot take $55 billion out of the economy tomorrow. So if we use a $2 trillion economy, that's 2.5% that you would take out. You'd kill the economy. You have to gradually pull it out, hoping that the private sector is strong enough to support it. And that's what Stephen Harper did. He gradually pulled things out. And that's how basically, if you're going to want to use Keynesian economics, that's how you do it. You have to ensure that you gradually pull things out. This is just showing you the net change that's tied to the number, the net debt change to what it's made up of, and I showed you between the deficits and between capital purchases. It gives you an idea what's happening. Job quality. Goodale stands up and says job quality is the worst it's been in 25 years. Okay, let's take a look at steps of what influences job quality. Okay, job quality is influenced by opportunities. And how are opportunities created? Well, they're created by a strong investment community where we're investing in businesses, investing three. They also start with education. If we are promoting people to go into the wrong educational courses, whether that's history or geography, and coming out with skills that are not in demand, okay, or not aligned to what's required by business, then that leads to job quality issues. The other issue that you're dealing with is automations happen. Like even on the accounting side, which I can speak of firsthand, is a lot of automations come in the accounts payable and the accounts receivable side where we don't need those clerks anymore. We've also seen where robotic weldings come in and laser welding. We're actually using more modernization. We've also seen too as well that we've changed how education is delivered. There's more webinars, WebExes, so we don't need space anymore. So we can talk about different things of it, but you have to look in perspective what's changed in terms of the dynamics of the workforce. What also has changed is we've lost significant jobs. Okay, and some of that's through failed policies at the provincial level through Kathleen Wynne and Dalton McGuinty, who decided that fit at all costs would actually be better for it. And what they did is they replaced temporary jobs, not temporary jobs, manufacturing jobs with temporary ones for installers which eats into that casual work thing. But the Liberal Party and even the NDP to a certain degree will never talk about that dynamic. What they'll talk about is the overall result. Okay, it's up to you guys to go through these stuff and look at the overall flow. Who's got the right plan to kind of trigger economic growth that will support this? Stephen Harper's had taken different approaches to kind of look at different sectors of the economy, from manufacturing to aerospace part of manufacturing to resource management. But he gets caught up with resistance from provinces making bad policies. And some of those bad policies are driven by social agendas. And in the case of BC, they decided they're trying to push more to the activist green energy sector, so they brought in carbon pricing. Okay, yes, you can say it worked on certain things, but it also added about 2 to 4% in cost. So how do they buffer that? They reduce taxes down, but that doesn't cover the fact that the cost of living in Vancouver is one of the highest in Canada. And Justin Trudeau and Thomas Mulcair are running on a cap and trade system. All that's going to do is basically add more cost to people, and that's going to help impact on their quality of life. Stephen Harper doesn't want a federal cap and trade tax right now. He said he will look at it and revisit it as part of the overall North American system, but right now he doesn't feel it's justifiable. So you need to keep that in mind. The other thing that you need to bear in mind too is we have a significant skills gap. Why do we have that? It comes back to people don't want to go into become an electrician, don't want to become a plumber, maybe not an engineer. Anything where we need skills. They were sold by the educational system to basically get a degree and you'll be set for life. Well, get a degree in the right area, which is never communicated. That's part of it as well. Let's talk about his second comment. He talked about 2 recessions. First of all, the 2008 and 2009 recession was the big one, which basically was triggered by the U.S. housing market, and Canada was able to weather the storm, and for the bulk of the last 7-8 years they were one of the leaders in GDP growth within the G7. Now they've since been surpassed by the UK and the US. However, they're still strong within the G8 or G7 group. You won't hear that. Okay? What you're hearing from Goodale is he caused recessions. Well, you don't cause recessions when you've got global pressures on you. Harper didn't ask for the global meltdown in 2008, 2009. Harper has no control over commodity prices like oil. That's set by OPEC, as well as other demands like metals like aluminum, nickel. That's set by mercantile exchanges. The other thing is you're going to hear the opposition say he spent too much time on oil. That's not necessarily true. Oil is a big piece of it, but if you look at different policies from his the Sustainable Development Tech Corporation, which is a good tie-in, because that's what Ralph Goodale created, that Harper continues the fund, which is never discussed, and only recently it's come up from Justin Trudeau saying we need to put more money into that program. We do, but we need to make sure it's done right. You're never going to hear that from Justin Trudeau. It's like throw money at the problem, deal with it later. That's a Liberal solution, along with the NDP. The second recession that we're talking about right now, which is basically we've had 2 quarters where we've had negative growth. Okay, and that's how you measure a recession. However, you do need to look at the factors. And we've seen a solid job market. We've seen 200,000 new jobs created in the last year. We've seen strong housing market. Exports are down, but they're still achievable because the U.S. is picking up. We've seen consumer spending up. So typically when you have a recession, you usually see people clawing back on consumer spending. You see housing start go down. You also see a big drop in exports, and that puts pressure on people in the labor market because they're not spending money, which then hurts the economy. That's not what we're seeing right now. Even the Bank of Nova Scotia, or Scotia Bank, and you don't have to trust my word, you can go out to the site, have actually said it was a non-recession. Yes, we had drop down, but it's not a typical recession because the fundamentals are strong. And this slide here kind of ties back to where I said about the 100,000 to 200,000 jobs. Now let's talk about the 1990s versus 2000. The reason I bring it in, because whenever you look at graphs, and this is what Unifor likes to do, is they throw graphs up, okay, and look at trends. Yes, it's good to look at the overall trend, but unless you understand the details, what's happening, and align that with trend lines with economic growth or other facets of government policy, the graphs are not meaningful. Graphs have to be taken that they're aligned, that they're comparable. I can throw a graph up of anything, but is that graph meaningful? Does it tell the right picture? In the 90s, we've seen a Canadian dollar between 60 and 73 cents. It's now subsequently come down to that range. We've seen a GDP growth in the US of 4.5% versus about 2% now. Electrical rates in Ontario were very affordable. They now are some of the highest in North America. China was basically non-existent as a trading partner. Now we have combined trade about 50 billion between exports and imports. We also now see productivity issues were masked because a lower dollar meant, even though we didn't invest heavily in capital or other aspects to bring down up productivity, what we were doing was using the low dollar basically to mask that. Automotive sector in the 90s was about $18 billion units. We went as low as 9 million units in 2008. Canada's production level of automotive used to be about 20%. It's down close to 13%. A lot of the new production's gone to low cost producing countries like Mexico. Some of that has been driven by our labor rates, but also hydro rates and other overall issues that companies are looking at it. If you don't believe me, go do a search on what Magnum said about Ontario policies, as well as Chrysler said about hydro rates, because they will tell you exactly the same thing I said. Ontario has become very uncompetitive for business. That has nothing to do with Harper. That has all to do with provincial policies, because Harper has no control over hydro rates and local taxation issues like bringing in an Ontario registered pension plan or any carbon taxing. That's there. Housing starts were very strong in the 90s. My latest trends that I looked at in July 2015, housing starts are back up to where they were in the mid-90s. We haven't seen that type of growth. So it took about a 10-year period to stabilize the real estate market in the U.S. to bring people back in. That's not known. The oil industry at the time was not into non-conventional extraction, and that's why we saw a big boom with the Balkan in the 2000s, because we were able to, through new technology, through heating up stones and extracting the oil through the rock. We've seen that become a bigger play into non-conventional, but that's more expensive. So the U.S. itself now is reducing its dependency on foreign oil, and they don't treat Canada as foreign oil. They treat Canada as domestic oil, and most of the bulk of the Canada oil sands go to the U.S. And that's the reason why when you watch the oil sands, it's priced a certain way, because of the mechanisms in play and the way we have to cost it out and price it to the U.S. That's the reason why. Green technology has been around for decades, but it's only become more viable because we've got better fuel cell technology, better processes in terms of the sciences to better leverage in terms of bringing technology from incubation to market. The STT, the Sustainable Development Tech Corporation, was brought into play, and that came into play under Goodale that Stephen Harper is using to help provide seed funding. Let's talk about trade surpluses and all that. Now, yes, we have a trade imbalance. Okay, we've had some trade ups and downs. A lot of that drives from the key players like China, depending on how much we import or exports from China. Now, in the U.S. case, in 2014 and 2011, we had an overall trade balance. But guess what? Goodale never talks about that. He talks about the last few months of trade imbalances. Now let's talk about that. If we have a trade imbalance, it either means we're exporting less or importing more. Okay? So oil has been down. So oil's been down around roughly about 3 billion in exports. That's leading to a lot of the deficit right now. And the other thing is we still are importing a lot of goods, finished goods from China and other countries as part of doing that. If you're going to close the trade balance down, oil is one of the options to do it, as well as expanding other options with upselling opportunities of Canadian goods. You can't do that without proper trade and investment agreements. How come Goodale never talks about that? Well, because he can't win an election on what Harper has in play. Like South Korea, we'll see a potential uptick in that. Europe, too, we got a new deal for them. Other countries like Colombia are becoming global players. And he's got deals in play in the background that he's negotiating with India, as well as South Africa to kind of bring trade up, to improve on that trade imbalance. But you won't hear that from Goodale because he can't win on that. This just shows you basically the key aspects of exports and the key players here. Same with imports by year. Trade surplus just shows you by year who's the major players. Now I wanted to show you this one because I've been on too many blogs where there's a misnomer here. Canada owns its resources. Okay, it controls it. What they allow companies is leases or the rights to mine those resources. But Canada controls it. They still have to fall under government regulations in terms of environmental standards, which isn't discussed. The other thing too, if you look at foreign direct investment, that's critical a measuring tool for a country. Are you attracting new capital dollars to bring into this country? Goodale never talks about that. Why? Well, because he can't sell it the fact that Harper has been working with various countries to bring it in. Look at this example here. In 2013, the bulk of FDI came from the U.S. Where did it go? A good chunk of it went to the oil sands, but also the branch plants up here like Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, or other forestry plants we've seen that are food processing. But look at the other countries that's a big player in here. The Netherlands. Well, who do you think the Netherlands deals with a lot? Food processing, oil, Shell comes from there. So that's what you're seeing here. So I wanted to show you that to kind of show you the tie-in to exports directly attributed to foreign direct investment. The other issue that you have to understand a bit too with capital, Canada is only so big in terms of its capital market. So if I'm raising capital for a project, I can only get so much money from the banks here, so much money for a stock issue. I have to really rely on other investment communities to come in and invest in me. The next slide you're seeing here is the EDC. It's been around for decades, but it's an option for companies, small, medium-sized business, large, to work with an entity to help get some security protection on their receivables as they look to expand in other markets. Stephen Harper's looked at expanding EDC to help better support exports. The funny thing is, and the ironic thing is, neither the Liberal Party or the NDP actually talk about EDC. They don't talk about exports. They talk about exports in a holistic view, but they don't ever talk about particulars because it's very easy to say their plan's not working. But what they don't say is what would their plan be to improve on that? That's what you need to ask those questions. And this just kind of shows you the role of exports. That basically it shows you about the people that would benefit from it in terms of the overall flow of the economy. Talks about jobs here, about 500,000 jobs. It talks about how much it generates to the GDP in terms of national income. This just basically shows you a chart in terms of export forecast and growth. The U.S. is figured to pick up more later on this year. China is a little bit concerning because of the issues that you're faced with the stock market there, but China still has the ability and the reserves to kind of pump up their economy, which will support exports and their consumer population there. And this shows you kind of a breakdown where you'd like to see in terms of the export potential of the growth. You're seeing energy big there, but you're also seeing plastics, agricultural food, which is a good area to be focused on, aircraft, industrial equipment, and all that. And you're seeing growth by provinces as well. This is a good chart to show you that. The reason why I show you this is show you some data here. Let's talk about household debt now. It comes up quite a bit here. Yes, there's certain things the government controls at a federal level. They control the mortgage rules in terms of the terms of the mortgages. Okay, and you're going to hear the argument, and I've pulled into blogs on this. Well, Harper should have did more on mortgages. Now, you got to be very, very careful here. One of the good measuring stick in terms of looking at an economy and its success, people bank on the equity of those homes. Okay, so if you make it difficult for people to enter the market, you're actually not helping your economy in the housing market. So you have to have the right balance. Did the government get all the policies right? No, they didn't. When they started doing 30 and 35-year mortgages to stretch out the amortization big mortgages, probably wasn't the right thing to do. But gradually over the last term, before Mr. Flaherty passed on, they brought down the mortgage term back down where it should have been, 25 years. That's one aspect of it. Second aspect that you're getting into is there hasn't been a relook at from the banks to kind of look at how you qualify people for mortgages. Okay, and that's where we probably should be looking at new policies around that enforced by the bank, and that means looking at income growth, looking at the cost of those houses of when they were built, and look at the overall flow to make sure that the growth isn't not sustainable. Because right now you're hearing different things from different banks that the mortgage prices, their housing prices are 25% higher than they should be. Why is that? Because when you have low interest rates, you're trying to bring people into a market. Okay. Now, government could push more people out, but you have to have the right policy mix, and you also have to have the banks to be a lot smarter in certain things in terms of how they grant stuff. People also need to kind of look at their budgets and their goals. I believe wholeheartedly where we failed people is the high schools themselves are not doing a household finance course. If you put that household finance course back into and start teaching people about budgeting, you would start to see a better change in philosophy. But the Liberal and the NDP don't take that philosophy. They want to save you. They want to protect you. They want to be the saviors to you. So that's what they're positioning on their platform is. Now, I also challenge you to look at some myths about it. Is household debt, yes, it's growing, but there are some myths about it. And the fact is, if you look at a BMO study, it's actually slowed down its growth. The other thing is the equity between houses is actually pretty solid. So there's some misdemeanors about that. The other thing too is there's been some changes, and I'll give the NDP credit here. They have pushed for credit card reforms, and Harper's got a bill, or if it hasn't been passed, it will be passed, to kind of put some controls around interest rate hikes. Student debt is very high. That factors in the consumer debt, household debt. Now, student debt also comes back to what I talked earlier about job quality. People going through the wrong degrees now are working part-time in restaurants or retail. And again, I'm not discounting those people. Those jobs are required. But if we're not aligning the skills and these people are sold the wrong path, then guess what happens of that population? It happens that way. That basically wraps up the recording. I wanted to kind of give you all that. I basically was discounting a lot what Ralph Goodale said with actual facts, and I actually provide you a link to basically where you can go out and look for things. You don't have to trust me. It's not up for you to trust me or believe me. I'm just presenting you an opinion for you to go out and do further research. Thank you very much.